The sociological approaches to critical theory include not just the evolution of Marxist criticism, but also that of historicism into new historicism, cultural materialism, postcolonial theory, and recent studies on interculturalism and multiculturalism. All of them are concerned with the social and cultural impact of human creations, including art and literature. This lecture deals with these critical movements, tracing the evolution of historicism into new historicism and cultural materialism. It also refers to their interrelations with phenomenology and hermeneutics, and it mentions some of the main figures in these critical trends. New historicism emerged in the United States in the late 1970s and developed from previous traditions of historicism. Historicism began towards the end of the 18th century in Europe, evolving from the so-called Geistesgeschichte German tradition of intellectual history, that is, the history of ideas and world views. During the Enlightenment, change began to be seen as a fundamental concept to understand social reality. In the previous Aristotelian Thomist tradition, a substantialist view of change was applied, and the implication was that human creatures had essential properties unchangeable over time. This thought left little room for history, which was mainly used as a sort of memory repository of examples dealing with life and public affairs. During the Scottish Enlightenment, the early forms of empiricism developed by David Hume and John Locke opened the way to new ideas of historical change and evolution that would materialize in Germany under Johann Gottfried Herder and later in Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories. Herder began to articulate the idea based on Gottfried Leibniz on the concepts of monads, that human identity or essence lies in their development from the past, and that being derived from becoming through different phases of development. Above all, historicism was the offspring of Hegelian idealism. Friedrich Hegel's approach to history was metaphysical and derived from his transcendental philosophy. To him, the literary work was understood as the poetic expression of a moment in the unfolding narrative of history, as the self-realization of the absolute. Contemporaries such as Wilhelm von Humboldt or Leopold von Ranke were ambiguous about the status of what they called organic wholes, referring to the supposedly unchanging substances such as nations, cultures, epochs. They try to solve this problem with the notion of a sort of time-bound forms under the terms zeitgeist and Volksgeist, or to give some more recent examples, ideology, mentality, paradigm, discourse, or episteme. Although they might not be visible, these forms possess a motivating force or organizing principle, entelechy, which marks them into historical essences or monads. In this way, at a time of emerging nationalism and territorial shifts, the nation became the expression of this evolving spirit, as British philosopher Thomas Carlyle summed up in the following quote: "The history of a nation's poetry is the essence of its history, political, scientific, and religious." The historicist tradition continued in France in the work of Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve and Hippolyte Taine, who insisted on viewing literary texts as integrally informed by their historical milieu as well as race and moment, and not just as a product of the author's imaginations. This trend was known as nationalistic historicism, a relativistic variant of the metaphysical, in which the literary work was viewed as expressing the native spirit of a given culture or race. And also, it was different from aesthetic historicism, which contemplated art not as representations or reflection of thought in particular period, but as a way of making cultural meaning and values. There was also a positivist trend within historicism, which came from the evolutionary naturalism of Herbert Spencer. It treated the literary text as a medium viewed by a scholar who imagined himself in the role of a scientific observer at a given time. According to this position, notions of change appear in relation to the transformation of a static into a dynamic worldview. In the early 20th century, the trend became influenced by science, in particular Albert Einstein's theories of relativity, and Maurice Mandelbaum incorporated, and I quote, the belief that an adequate understanding of the nature of any phenomenon and an adequate assessment of its value are to be gained through considering it in terms of the place it occupied and the role it played within a process of development. This implied that historians should not approach their subject in an anachronistic way by looking at it solely through the lenses of their own time. Karl Popper added that, and this is again a quote, that it is the task of the social sciences to lay bare the law of evolution of society in order to foretell its future. I would like to mention briefly the development of phenomenology, which in a way influenced the changes from historicism to new historicism. In the aftermath of World War I, German philosopher Edmund Husserl sought to develop a method to inquire on the nature of reality and knowledge. He argued that although we cannot be certain of the independent existence of things, we can experience them in consciousness as real or as illusion. This consciousness is active and intends to establish certainty. So to explore this relationship, Husserl's method sought to do two things. First, concentrate on a particular phenomenon, object or event, and exclude everything else which was not immanent to consciousness in order to grasp what it is essential and unchanging about that phenomenon. Secondly, one should effect what he called an eidetic abstraction, a sort of Kantian transcendental or intuitive mode of inquiry. In other words, it is not just about the concrete scientific or psychological knowledge of the thing, but about the deep structures and conditions that make this knowledge possible, and about how human intentional consciousness links phenomena and meaning. Thus, although phenomenology advances the belief that humans are prior to history and social conditions, providing an alternative to positivist notions that contemplated humanity as the result of natural selection, phenomenology gives centrality to the human subject in the act of knowing. So the experiences over time and space are disregarded, and the relationship between self and others are also not taken into consideration. So in its application to critical theory, phenomenology influenced the evolution of Russian formalism into other forms of criticism, new criticism, for example, by emphasizing the presence of the author's consciousness in the text. But it is an idealist, essentialist, and anti-historical type of criticism that gives importance to thought, but not to language. So for Husserl, what supplies meaningfulness to experience is not language, but the act of perceiving particular phenomena as universal, an act which is supposed to occur independently of language itself. This is not because meaning is something which predates language. Language is not more than a secondary activity for Husserl, which gives names to meanings somehow there before. The deficiencies in Husserl's argument brought Martin Heidegger to break with his system of thought. Heidegger rejects his academic mentor's starting point in the transcendental subject and sets out to explore the existence of a mode of being which is specifically human and which is always bound up with others, so that it is socially constitutive of life. He calls it being in the world, and he argues that humans emerge as subjects in this reality amid objects and others. In his major work, Being and Time, from 1927, Heidegger begins to decenter the transcendental ego from the position of dominance that it had occupied since the Enlightenment. Human existence and cognition is a dialogue with the world, and it is always changing, always changing in time, in history. Time is the very structure of human life, an inner dynamic. Heidegger uses the term Dasein to refer to this inner dynamic. Language is not just an instrument of communication, but the dimension of time in which humans move, according to Heidegger. So language is memory and cognition, and through them the world comes into existence. Being is not separate from the subject that speaks or the object that is spoken to. It is both, and it only emerges in the context of socialization and common interests. So Heidegger's thought contains the germs of functionalism as well. Things are insofar as they are semiotically interpreted as signs for our practical actions. Knowing is deeply related to doing. But for Heidegger, art and its use of defamiliarizing techniques draws attention to the functionality of things, even if they are not manifest. For example, a broken hammer is always a hammer. As for semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce, art is a language which only becomes meaningful expression when it is interpreted by a subject. It is through the subject's semiotic interpretation that the world speaks. A sign is only a sign when an interpretant recognizes it as such. It is also important to explain that the concept of time is different to history. Time is a more abstract and metaphysical notion linked to personal experience. History, on the other hand, is related to social memory and the record of events designated as historical. So Heidegger uses the term Geschichte to refer to what happens as meaningfully experienced in personal awareness, what Louis Bergson would also call subjective time later. Heidegger describes his philosophical enterprise as a hermeneutics of being, and the word hermeneutics means the science or art of interpretation. Indeed, hermeneutics was originally confined to the interpretation of sacred scripture, the Bible. But during the 19th century, it broadened its scope to encompass the problem of textual interpretation as a whole. Heidegger's most celebrated successor, Hans-Georg Gadamer, focuses on a study entitled Truth and Method, which was published in 1960, and which explores the meaning of a literary text and inquires into the role of the author's intention and if the text can be understood apart from its historical and cultural context. Gadamer also questions if understanding is relative to our own historical situation. The basic ideas are the following: that All interpretations are situational and constrained by the historical relative criteria of a particular culture, and that interpretations consist in a dialogue between the present and the past. So that interpretation is a matter of coming home to the past. Gadamer used this expression. There were problems to his theory, of course, because he fails to recognize ideology and the fact that history is not just a dialogue and that it can become a monologue between the powerful and the powerless. It is also a theory based upon tradition and the classics as the national canon. So the theory assumes there is a single mainstream tradition which all valid works participate in, and that history is an unbroken continuum, focusing particularly in the German tradition in this case and national pride. Because hermeneutics was based on the inalterable meaning of the sacred scripture and preserved through time, these critics extended these ideas to any kind of text. American hermeneutics Eric Donald Hirsch followed Gadamer's ideas and argued in the Validity in Interpretation from 1967 that there is not just one possible interpretation of text, identical with what the author meant at the time of writing. There may be a number of different valid interpretations, but all of them must move within the system of typical expectations and probabilities which the author's meaning permits. So in order to pursue the most possible objectivist approach on historicism, Hirsch proposed a distinction between meaning, which embraces what the author meant or intended by his particular use of language, and significance, the subjective evaluation of the text according to the values and beliefs of the reader and critic. So he explains that significance and meaning are not the same thing, and that a literary work may signify different things to different people at different times, even if the original meaning of the work was decided by the author. So authors put in meanings, whereas readers assign significances. And because readers may not know the author's intentions, it might be difficult to hit on the right interpretation of a text. In other words, for Hirsch, literary meaning is absolute and immutable, wholly resistant to historical change. In order to support his claim, he follows Husserl's ideas that meaning is pre-linguistic and it is in someone's head before language happens. Meaning is related to the author's intention, and the reader is at pains to discover and interpret what these intentions and meanings might be. Furthermore, meaning is never socialized. It's never a dialogue between the author and its readers, like Gadamer wanted. It's always belonged to the author. So Hirsch's subsequent research focused on literacy and education, but his initial position is impossible to understand in the light of previous work by Ferdinand de Saussure or Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, who recognized that meaning is not something expressed and reflected in language, but produced by it. It is not as though we have meanings or experiences which we then proceed to cloak with words. We can only have the meanings and experience in the first place because we have a language to have them. What this suggests, moreover, is that our experience as individuals is social at its roots. For there can be no such thing as private language, or to imagine a language is to imagine a whole form of social life. So, however, it is important to clarify that although Hirsch was a follower of Gadamer, for Gadamer, as for Heidegger, the meaning of literary work is never exhausted by the intentions of its author. As the work passes from one cultural historical context to another, new meanings appear that were not anticipated by the author. Interpretation is situational, shaped and constrained by historically relative criteria of a particular culture. As we have mentioned, for Heidegger and for Gadamer, interpretation is a dialogue between past and present, and understanding is productive because in knowing the past, we can know the present. So Gadamer offered the notion of horizon fusion, whereby we both acknowledge that what we call the text is in fact a product of a tradition of interpretation informed by the past and the present. So the key here is that interpretations are constrained by our position or horizon in society and in history. The event of understanding comes about when our horizon of historical meanings and assumptions fuses with the horizon within the work itself, within which the work itself is placed. So here T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent from 1919 comes into play because for Gadamer, as for Eliot, valid texts belong to tradition, a sort of unifying essence that runs beneath historical time. In other words, readers would have preconceptions that run alongside the authority of tradition. Tradition and Individual Talent, published in The Egoist, and later forming part of Eliot's first book of criticism, The Sacred Wood, included also in his selected prose and selected essays, posits that literature is a unique body of human knowledge, different from historical knowledge. Eliot adds that unlike the German hermeneutic tradition, the English tradition generally upholds the belief that art progresses through change, separating from tradition. He affirms that any new work alters the way in which the past is seen, and that this creates tradition. In Eliot's own words and quotation, what happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it. In another essay entitled Hamlet and His Problems, Eliot presents the concept of the objective correlative. The theory is that the expression of emotion in art can be achieved by a specific and almost formulaic prescription of a set of objects, including events and situations. A particular emotion is created by presenting its correlated objective sign. The author is depersonalized in this conception, since he is the mere effector of the sign. And it is the sign and not the poet which creates the emotion. So the language of poetry communicates by objective correlatives, deep symbols and images that bypass rational thought and seize readers by, and I quote, the cerebral cortex, the nervous systems, the digestive tracts. Images should penetrate the primitive levels at which all men and women experience alike, through symbols, rhythms, archetypes, images of death and resurrection. This is a quote from Eliot. So Eliot's view is aligned with British conservative politics and marks a period where the main problem is that history is not understood as a site of power struggle and exclusion, but the location of a sort of sacred tradition that separates the authors from readers' interpretations. If a reader critically challenges this tradition, this criticism might not be tolerated because it alters not just the present, but the past. These forms of all historicism dominated literary scholarship well into the 1960s. For many of these critics, history and culture form a seamlessly unified system of meanings which could not be disturbed by unorthodox or dissenting voices. In the 1960s and 70s, many historians advocated a merger with social sciences like sociology, political science, and anthropology. Among the sociological approaches that were revisited were those by Karl Mannheim, who had developed a sociology of knowledge connecting historicism and functionalism, influencing the development of social constructivism, and Ernst Cassirer, who in Substance and Function had also dealt with the problem of knowledge and time in terms of functions and relations. These approaches were not entirely successful in driving out the traditional ontology of substances and essences, because common sense seems to suggest that change is attributable only to something remaining partially the same through time. Many scholars began by exploring again the Enlightenment, and in particular the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, as Cassirer did. Philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, like John Locke and David Hume, had brought forth the idea of the law of unintended consequences. In narrative, for instance, the author constructs the story according to his or her intentions, as Gadamer had formulated, but there could be unintended consequences in the actions that the author projects on his or her characters. This creates an ironic tension that extends to the readers, as they might identify with the characters as agents of the actions in the plot. This perspective opened the door to contemplating more critical interpretations in the text linked to particular historical and cultural periods. The main intention in this introduction has been to shed some light on the various critical approaches that have informed the emergence of new historicism, that is, the evolution of phenomenology, structuralism, as well as the origins of reader-response theory and hermeneutics. The most important tenets in new historicism is the insistence that all systems of thought, all phenomena, institutions, works of art, literary texts must be situated within a historical perspective because they are determined in both their form and content by their specific historical circumstances. Thus, human productions and artifacts are products of a broader sociocultural context shaped by politics, religion, and the economy, all of which are grounded in the system of human communication and discourse. Additionally, there is also the recognition that societies and cultures have differing values and beliefs, and that individual agents have their own world views, so that in the case of the literary text, both authors and readers impose their own ideas, motives, interests, and prejudices. However, one of the problems of new historicism is the definition of context. Although it seems possible to place a text or an event in a historical context, this is only achieved by circumscribing that context into a wider one, in a sort of infinite regress. Although Marx had a profound impact on historicist thinking, new historicism avoided Marxist economic determinism. Marxism, at least in its more orthodox forms, tend to see literature as part of a superstructure established upon an economic base and material relations of production. New historicism has sought to unveil the complexity of the network of relations between the subsystems of society, dealing with the importance of local socio-political context for the understanding of literary texts. Alongside the influences just mentioned, new historicism has also been influenced by symbolic anthropology, most notably American professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, Clifford Geertz. His most important contribution to new historicism is the belief that the study of past cultures as other can help gain a more critical perspective on our own culture and its ideological constraints. Another very important influence upon new historicism is the post-structuralist intellectual revolution of the 1970s, which established a new set of assumptions as follows. First, there are two meanings of the word history: the events of the past and telling a story about the events of the past. Post-structuralist thought makes it clear that history is always narrated and that the past can never be available to us in pure form, but always in the form of representations, all of which are textualized. Another change is that the historical periods are no longer viewed as unified entities. There is no single story, only discontinuous and contradictory stories, and the illusion of a unified culture is imposed and propagated by the ruling classes in their own interests. As a consequence, historians can no longer claim that their study of the past is detached and objective, since any theory is an interpretation and a subjective construct. In this panorama, the relations between literature and history must be rethought. There is no stable and fixed historical context, which can be treated as the background against which literature can be foregrounded. Furthermore, history becomes telling, it becomes another story. Literary texts are no longer regarded as forms of the aesthetically sublime and transcendent expressions of the human spirit, but as texts among other texts. There are no privileged canonical positions where the inner world of the insightful artist can be set against the background of an outer world of ordinary people. Early forms of historicism had emphasized the unifying function of culture, the Geist of an age, a nation, a civilization, or a race, or in more empirical positivist historical method into the more narrowly defined but still unitary political or social event, action, interest group, or in the specific domain of aesthetics, the notion of period, style, or tradition, as in Eliot's argument. This tendency to contain plurality within a higher unity, to reinscribe difference within an organic conception, has characterized historicism until the 1960s. Thus, these early forms of historicism were all what François Lyotard has termed grandmaster narratives, governing historical criticism. The French philosopher taught at the Lycée of Constantine in Algeria between 1950 and 1952, and he was director of the International College of Philosophy, which was founded by Jacques Derrida, the main exponent of the critical method known as deconstruction. In 1972, Lyotard began teaching at University Paris 8, Vincent Saint-Denis, and in 1987 he became professor emeritus. He was also a visiting professor at University of California, Irvine, and many other institutions worldwide. His very important volume, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge from 1977, identifies two meta-narratives whereby knowledge and its institutions were legitimized in the modern era. The first of these is the emancipatory narrative, associated with the Enlightenment, egalitarianism, and with the French Revolution. The second, more specifically philosophical, is that of the German idealist tradition, descending from Kant and Hegel, as we have already seen. Lyotard discusses the declining credibility of such grand narratives, a decline that is in direct proportion to the preeminence given to technology from the beginnings of industrialization to the current revolution in information technologies. In this context, a mode of legitimation emerges in which the goal is no longer truth, but performativity, that is, the best possible input-output equation. The state or the companies must abandon the idealist and humanistic narratives of legitimation in order to justify the new goal, the financial power. Lyotard emphasizes that it is conceivable that nation-states will gradually fight for control of information, as it is happening today, just as they battled in the past for control over territory and afterwards for control of access to and for exploitation of raw materials and cheap labor. Indeed, with the rise of multinational corporations, the very idea of the autonomous nation-states begins to break down. The last move in Lyotard's analysis is to envision a strategy for legitimating knowledge that is appropriate to the postmodern condition, a mode of legitimation that Lyotard terms paralogy. A major strength of new historicism has been the incorporation of this examination of the textuality and intertextuality of historical relations between canonical literary text and other kinds of cultural data, helping dislocate the notion of canon and conforming to the postmodern critical practice that Lyotard terms paralogy. The practice of paralogy derives from Wittgenstein's concept of language games. Lyotard characterizes postmodern discourse as an heterogeneous group of language games which diverge from previous grand narratives. Paralogy is the ongoing creation of meaning. You say something and it inspires me to say something in return. Consensus, Lyotard tells us, is merely a stage in our conversation. In this sense, Lyotard disputed Jürgen Habermas's notion of consensus and the goal of communicative action. What conversation can give us, it's much more valuable than that, according to Lyotard. It can encourage a process of dialogue that requires both of our parts, and when it works successfully, it can bring new expansion to our ideas. That is paralogy. As Frederick Jameson suggests in his introduction to the 1984 re-edition of Lyotard's text, and I quote, Lyotard's ultimate vision of science and knowledge today is as a search not for consensus, but very precisely for instabilities, in which the point is not to reach agreement, but to undermine from within the very framework in which the previous normal science had been conducted. So, to read the world after all, writes Alan Liu, another exponent of new criticism, is not, and I quote, an ideologically neutral act. It is to appropriate the world from the masses of the less articulate and literate. It is a statement of privilege, of new fugitivism. So paralogy is similar to what Edward Said in his volume The World, the Text and the Critic calls oppositional criticism. And to write oppositionally means to acknowledge at least a provisional subject position within a shared political and social practice that resists cultural domination and containment. As mentioned, Lyotard views discourses as language games. None are privileged. People are characters or nodes where pluralistic lines of discourse intersect. Like Adorno, he argues that avant-garde is a non-organic art, the only possible authentic expression of alienation in late capitalist society. Art becomes removed from life as all forms of knowledge become computerized data. And you have a couple of quotations from Lyotard. In the computer age, the question of knowledge is now more than ever a question of government. And the second quotation, the function of the state will change. Machines will come to play an important role in regulatory and reproductive processes, and the power to make decisions will increasingly be determined by questions of access to information. In The Inhuman, a volume from 1988, Lyotard illustrates a world where technology has completely taken over. Alongside these influences, another decisive influence on new historicism has been Michel Foucault's conception of episteme, contemplated as structures of thought that shape everyone and everything within a culture and are thus historically bound. New historicism produces periodization according to these epistemic changes, rather than through chronology of events. All events are seen as embedded in a network of material practices, including critical methods which participate in the economy they describe. That is, the assumption that in a given historical moment, different modes of discourse, such as those involved in law, theology, moral philosophy, science, the arts, and so on, are not autonomous, and that by studying the permeable boundaries of the discourses constitutive of an episteme, it is possible to understand the underlying ideological codes. For Foucault, contextualization is a superstructure, which is not based on an economic foundation, but on a network of contradictory, competing, and unreconciled discourses that form the language of economics as well as other languages. In other words, Foucault's argument shifted the notion of infrastructure from a terminology of economics to a terminology of power relations, linked to the capacity to gain ground through language. However, new historicism has been concerned not only with situating literary texts within power structures, but also with seeing them as crucially participating in conflicts of power between various forms of social and political authority. They have also rejected the Hegelian idea of historical progress or teleology and have broken away with literary historiography based on the development of literary genres. The most important influence by Foucault are his two volumes, The Order of Things from 1966 and The Archaeology of Knowledge from 1969, which offered accounts of the growth of knowledge in the modern Western world as manifested in the emergence of disciplines such as linguistics, economics, and biology. He elaborated a historical scheme of three epistemes, outlooks underlying the institutional organizations of knowledge that characterize the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, also called the classical period in the text, and the modern world. Foucault often turned to genealogy, posing a question in the present and working backwards to inquire. The point from which he speaks, his place of enunciation, is always explicitly thematized in his works. This subject position is almost as, and I quote, if philosophy is memory or return of the origin, he writes. What I am doing cannot in any way be regarded as philosophy. And if the history of thought consists in giving life to half-effaced figures, what I'm doing is not history either. And this is a quote from The Archaeology of Knowledge. He remarks also that my discourse does not aim to dissipate oblivion or to discover in the depth of things the moment of their birth, whether this is seen as the empirical creation or the transcendental act that gives them origin. It does not set out to be a recollection of the original or a memory of truth. On the contrary, its task is to make differences. But how are we to construe the relation between the present and the past? Previous forms of historicism traditionally perform a neutral recounting of the past. Foucault showed that there is no standpoint of eternity and that all representations originate in its own present, in their own present. The function of memory is thus not simply the recollection of the past, it is rather an intervention, a rewriting of the past, producing a shift in the symbolic structure of the narrative that has brought us to the point where we are now. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault conjures up an imaginary interlocutor who challenges him to distinguish his work from structuralism. And then, upon hearing Foucault's reply, he says, and you have the quotation on your screen, "I can even accept that one should dispense, as far as one can, with a discussion of the speaking subjects, but I dispute that these successes of archaeology, as distinct from structuralism, give one the right to turn the analysis back onto the very forms of discourse that made them possible, and to question the very locus in which we are speaking today." So the interlocutor argues, we must acknowledge that the history of those analyses retains its own transcendence. And Foucault replies, "It seems to me that the difference between us lies there much more than in the over-discussed question of structuralism." So in his inquiry about genealogical memory and the relation between the present and the past, Foucault believes that the standard histories are the product of institutions that write grand narratives of the present, tales of the gradual emergence of truth and reason. And these histories, according to Foucault, are false and can be replaced by a more accurate account by the genealogist, who is not seduced by the mythology of a prevailing narrative. He knows that he might not have all his facts straight, and that one day someone may find it necessary to improve his account. In short, that his account is true but contingent, and perhaps true but written from a personal perspective. So this vacillation is inherited by new historicism. Foucault had similarly emphasized how social and political power works through the discursive regimes by which social institutions maintain themselves. Discourses are produced in which concepts of madness, criminality, sexual abnormality, and so on are defined in relation to concepts of sanity, justice, and sexual normality. Such discursive formations massively determine and constrain the forms of knowledge and the types of normality and the nature of subjectivity which prevails in particular periods. So they can also be dominant ways of controlling and preserving social relations of exploitation. As seen, since the emergence of post-structuralism in the 1970s, there has been a shift towards the examination of power relationships as the fundamental units for analysis and interpretation in cultural history, leading to a focus on aspects such as patronage, instruments of state power and control, but also as means of individual self-fashioning, shaping literary production, publishing, as well as the legitimation of practices and the role of art and culture in the formation of the modern nation-states, the delineation of separate domains of public and private space, etc. There is also a tendency to refuse hierarchies and dichotomies among forms of discourse and text, canonical, non-canonical, high culture, mass culture, history, story, and symptomatic forms of exploration that focus on the use of textual strategies and rhetorical devices that govern discourse and representation in a conscious and unconscious manner, evaluating the impact of human agency upon historical change. According to Hayden White, all the texts bear the traces of the history of subjectivity itself within a given culture. However, to say that history is always to a degree the construct of ideology is not to say that it is inevitably false. And you have a quotation there from White, Tropics of Discourse, Essays in Cultural Criticism. Historians are concerned with events which can be assigned to specific time-space locations, events which are or were, in principle, observable and perceivable, whereas imaginative writers, poets, novelists, playwrights are concerned with both these kinds of events or imagine hypothetical or invented ones, would argue that these mythic modes are more easily identifiable in historiographical than they are in literary texts. For historians, usually work with much less linguistic and therefore less poetic self-consciousness than writers of fiction do. They tend to treat language as a transparent vehicle of representation that brings no cognitive baggage of its own into that discourse. In his seminal 1973 book, Meta-History, The Historical Imagination of the 19th Century Europe, White claimed that the manifest historical text, jargon, is marked by strategies of explanation, which include three types: explanation by argument, explanation by embodiment, and explanation by ideological implication. He argued that historical writing was influenced by literary writing in many ways, sharing the strong reliance on narrative. So you have the quotation there on your screen. What is at issue here is not what are the facts, but rather how are the facts to be described in order to sanction one mode of explaining them rather than another. Some historians will insist that history cannot be a science until it finds the technical terminology adequate to the correct characterization of its objects of study, in the way that physics, calculus, or chemistry did. Others will continue to insist that the integrity of historiography depends on its use of ordinary language, its avoidance of jargon. These latter suppose that ordinary language is a safeguard against ideological deformation of the facts. What they fail to recognize is that ordinary language itself has its own forms of terminological determinism, represented by the figures of speech, without which discourse itself is impossible. Like other postmodern conceptions, new historicism tends to eschew the scatological or teleological connotations of the term history. In this regard, all human acts are seen functioning as part of a complex structural ensemble of cultural practices, both local and global, that can be explored at specific moments of historical change where different forms of representation and discourse intersect, but also contradict, destabilize, modify, and cancel each other under the force of dominance, and where the present is seen to interact with the past, which is partially reconstructed through human memory and ideological mechanisms. New historicism and postmodernism in general constitute the prerequisites of an emerging ethos, an ethos that implies a relation to what it was once confidently termed the self. Like many other contemporaries, new historicists have justly been resistant to notions of subjectivity in terms of identity. What some of these critics sense is that the need for an ethics based on the acknowledgement of difference, but also on the principle of relationship between the past, the present, and the future. So new historicism deconstructs the hierarchical opposition between history, traditionally conceived as factual, and literature, fictional. According to one of the exponents, Louis Montrose, this commitment derives from its practitioners' combined interest in the textuality of history and the historicity of text. Typically, the new historicists juxtaposed a literary text, originally Renaissance and later Romanticism, with historical evidence that documents its contemporary discourse and practices. This juxtaposition blurs the line between historical records and narrative fiction, considered texts of non-canonical importance. And these are used anecdotally to introduce the topic in an oblique and striking way. Another important characteristic of New Historicism and of many other forms of contemporary criticism is its performativity, first described by philosopher language John L. Austin as the capacity of speech and communication to act or to consummate an action, and later by Lyotard in relation to technology, which provides a means of controlling the context we call reality. And later again, under the influence of Austin, Foucault, and Althusser, gender theorist Judith Butler also argued that gender is socially constructed through commonplace speech acts and nonverbal communication that are performative, in that they serve to define and maintain subject positions. Performativity requires an imaginary relationship to others as agents of information, but also as part of a gender class, racially and ethnically hierarchical structure of institutional power. As Jacques Derrida affirms, and you have the quotation on your screen, every sign, linguistic or non-linguistic, spoken or written, in the current sense of this opposition, in a small or large unit, can be cited, put between quotation marks, and in doing so, it can break with every given context, engendering an infinity of new contexts in a manner which is absolutely illimitable. This does not imply that the mark is valid outside of a context, but on the contrary, that there are only contexts without any center or absolute anchorage. This situationality, this duplication or duplicity, this iterability of the mark is neither an accident nor an abnormality. It is that abnormal, without which a mark could not even have a function called normal. What would a mark be that could not be cited, or one whose origins would not get lost along the way? Thus, under the influence of deconstruction, New Historicism claims that the past can only be known to us as thrice processed. First, through its contemporary disruptive practices, the ideology or worldview. Second, through ours. And third, through the deflections and distortions engendered by language itself. Accordingly, a new historical reading of the past as text will resituate it by means of interpretation. For all its acknowledged heterogeneity, New Historicism shares some common assumptions, which I quote from Harold Viserve's volume from 1989 on New Historicism. Every expressive act is embedded in a network of material practices. Meaning and individual subjectivity are culturally constructed, and they can be thus reconstructed. Every act of unmasking, critique, and opposition uses the tool it condemns and risks falling prey to the practice it exposes. Literary and non-literary texts circulate inseparably. No discourse, imaginary or archival, gives access to unchanging truth, nor expresses inalterable human nature. And the last one, a critical method and a language adequate to describe culture under capitalism participate in the economy they describe. New Historicism is a reaction against all historicism, which insisted that to understand a literary piece, only the author's biography and sociocultural background were sufficient. Thus, it seeks to find meaning in text by considering them within the framework of prevailing ideas and assumptions at the time of the text's writing, examining power relations and assuming that history is not fixed essence but a cultural construction, every bit as subjective and as intentionally imaginative tests. So history is equal to story. Fact plus fiction are faction. The purpose of this critical inquiry is to locate hidden social messages, specifically those that promote oppressions, and to locate their uses and abuses of power. New Historicism is aware that interpretation of text is unavoidably subjective and biased, both psychologically and ideologically, and try to demystify the traditional view of historical studies as objective by stressing that partly unconscious and partly calculated negotiations of disciplinary, institutional, and societal demands and expectations are at work in the scholarly enterprise. And this is a quotation from Montrose. Montrose explicitly identifies this self-positioning as a personal investment in the subject of a study that performs a continuous reinvention of a past culture, but also its contribution to the reformation of the present. New historicism takes two forms: analysis of the work in the context in which it was created, and analysis of the work in the context in which it was critically evaluated. So the works tells us something about the surrounding ideology, slavery, the rights of women, and so on. The study of the ideology tells us something about the work. New historicism can also be considered a form of culture studies, alongside British cultural materialism, American multiculturalism, postmodernism, popular culture studies, post-colonial studies, and so on. In any case, all these are categories that are related to sociological analysis. One of the differences, however, is that new historicists insist in remaining apolitical in their orientation. Furthermore, new historicism advances a form of reception theory in that it recognizes that readers are influenced by their culture, so no objective reading of a work is possible. Readers, like critics, should consider how their own culture affects their interpretations of the historical influence on a work. Focus on revealing the historically specific model of truth and authority in a given work. In the early 1980s, Stephen Greenblatt, Catherine Gallagher, and Louis Montrose began to publish articles that challenge and problematize history in relation to fictional texts. The overall results had been a new awareness of the archival policies of historiography, from the fact of recording to the historian ulterior interpretation. The journal Representations was founded by Catherine Gallagher, Greenblatt, and Walter Benn, and others, and it was meant to consolidate new historicism as a set of practices, themes, preoccupations, and attitudes, rather than as a doctrine. Some of the major themes are the idea that the autonomous self and texts are mere effects produced by intersecting institutions, and moreover that they are defined by their relation to hostile others and to disciplinary power. Stephen Greenblatt is one of the founders of New Historicism. In his 1982 introduction to The Forms of Power and Power of Forms in the Renaissance, Greenblatt laid claim to an interest in New Historicism, a label that has since gained general currency. While he was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, he helped found the journal Representations, in which some of the earlier important New Historicist criticism appeared. Greenblatt books have laid out some of the theoretical bases of New Historicism. He argues for a cultural poetics whose goal is to study the social and cultural negotiations, transactions, and exchanges that underlie the making of a literary work. His approach destabilizes the text by shifting the focus of interest on its neglected, unrepresented, and misrepresented margins, the locus of cultural interchange with contemporary discourses. Greenblatt's work on Shakespeare illustrates a type of neo-historicism where this complex set of forces make evident the sustained power structures of a given historical moment. The Renaissance and early modern Europe are particularly important moments in this regard because different discourses can be said to coexist at that time. Mikhail Bakhtin, from a formalist perspective, as well as Timothy Rice, have pointed this out as well. Scholars have also argued that this period is the original moment of modern individualism and of early notions of subjectivity and of humanism. Psychoanalysis, the most powerful theory of subjectivity in critical discourse, is seen by Greenblatt as causally belated because the psychological categories it invokes are themselves the after effects of complex historical changes in the conception of the self. In other words, although many of Shakespeare's plays give voice to subversive ideas, such questionings of the prevalent social order are always contained within the terms of the discourses which hold that social order in place. The mad, the unruly, the alien are internalized others, which help us to consolidate our identities. Their existence is allowed only as evidence of the rightness of an established order. Greenblatt concludes pessimistically in his epilogue to Renaissance Self-Fashioning, a volume from 1980, and I quote, "In all my tests and documents, there were, so far as I could tell, no moments of pure, unfettered subjectivity. Indeed, the human subject itself began to seem remarkably unfree, the ideological product of the relations of power in a particular society." The work of Mikhail Bakhtin began to appear in translation during the early years of New Historicism, and it has been found as a way of escaping the apparent structural closure of Foucault's historical theory. Bakhtin regards carnival as a second culture, which was opposed to the official culture and which was carried on by the common people throughout the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period. Bakhtin's idea that carnival inserts its official structures and indeterminacy, a certain semantic open-endedness, could well provide one way of describing how subjects might respond to dominant discourses through the modalities of counter-identification. However, from Foucault's perspective, carnival could also be an officially permitted and carefully controlled expression of subversion, which by its ritualized form only confirms the power of the authority it mocks. Like Foucault, Greenblatt questions a strictly materialistic definition of power in which forms of repression can ultimately be tracked back to the individual or corporate ideologies of monarch, ministers, or administrations. Texts manufacture as well as reflect culture codes. Not only literature, a tissue of implicit reflexes of thought, but it also has the capacity to act upon such a network and modify it. And this is more explicitly argued in the introduction to his Renaissance Self-Fashioning from 1980, which explores the complex ways in which identity was created in the 16th century in an atmosphere of competition between various institutions, authorities, ideologies, political and religious, domestic and colonial. In another volume, The Power of Forms in the English Renaissance from 1982, Greenblatt differentiated what he termed the New Historicism from both New Criticism, which views the text as a self-contained structure, and the earlier forms of Historicism, which viewed history as an independent totality or unity, rather than as a product of ideologies of certain human groups. Greenblatt elaborated his statements about New Historicism in Towards a Poetics of Culture in 1987, not attempting to define New Historicism, but rather situate it as a practice. So Greenblatt remarks that his own critical practice has been informed by Foucault, as well as anthropological and social theory. In juxtaposing Jean-François Lyotard, postmodern, and Jameson's Marxist theories of how art serves specific social formations and ideologies, Greenblatt arrives at the conclusion that any explanatory model cannot be unitary, and that new historicism covers a set of aspirations rather than an internally consistent methodology. And the following is a quotation from referring to Jameson's. Jameson's seeking to expose the fallaciousness of separate artistic spheres and to celebrate the materialistic integration of all discourses, and finds that capitalism at the root of the false differentiation. Lyotard is seeking to celebrate the differentiation of all discourses and to expose the fallaciousness of monological unity, and finds capitalism at the root of the false integration. History functions in both cases as a convenient anecdotal ornament upon a theoretical structure, and capitalism appears not as a complex social and economical development in the West, but as a malign philosophical principle. To Greenblatt, neither Jameson nor Lyotard come to terms with apparently contradictory historical effects of capitalism. In contrast, he espouses a critical practice that would recognize capitalism's production of a powerful and effective oscillation between the establishment of distinct discursive domains and the collapse of those domains into one another. He argues that there is a need to describe the ways in which material is transferred from one discursive sphere to another and becomes aesthetic property, and the set of manipulations and negotiations that take place, away from a mimetic theory of art to an interpretative model. So Greenblatt's own characterization of the distinctive feature of capitalism as the oscillation between totalizing and fragmenting tendencies is as reductive as the positions he impugns. However, this insight is already contained in the work of previous Marxist thinkers. According to Greenblatt, the systematic organization of ordinary life and consciousness generates the pattern of boundary making and breaking. Production and distribution is not merely in the power of institutions. There are many actors involved and many reasons, from money to knowledge, prestige or taste.
Lucretius's On the Nature of Things is one of the great instances of cultural mobility. This was a text, a poem, a remarkable poem, written more than 2,000 years ago, itself based on ideas that are at least several hundred years older than that. It had some circulation at the time of Cicero and Julius Caesar and the poet Virgil. And then after a few hundred years of such circulation, it disappeared and is scarcely mentioned for more than 1,000 years. And then one day, in January of 1417, a book hunter, now obscure papal bureaucrat named Poggio Bracciolini, went into a monastic library and he found a copy and he took it off the shelf. And that, taking it off the shelf and recirculating it, getting it copied and having it begin once again to be read, turned out to have extraordinarily far-reaching consequences, though by no means immediately. It was just more like a butterfly's wing moving initially, just a tiny bit of movement. And this is, for me, the rediscovery of this ancient poem in 1417 is the paradigmatic instance of recirculation, of what it means for something to be put back in motion. Why is it significant? Because of everything that had been lost. Much of the classical heritage in general was lost. Many, many plays by Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, many great works of art, many great works of philosophy and of science and so forth, in the general collapse of ancient civilization. Among the things that didn't survive was a school of philosophy called Epicureanism in the Greek world. And it was that school of philosophy that was hanging by a thread, in effect, in this one great poem, Lucretius On the Nature of Things, that came back. With that poem came back the idea that the world is made up out of atoms and emptiness and nothing else. No mysterious demons, no angels, no forces moving the atoms around. that everything can come into existence without providence, that you don't need a creator, you don't need intelligent design to understand how complex beings in the universe, ants or cockroaches or humans, can exist. They come to exist because the atoms have been crashing together for untold thousands, tens of thousands, millions, billions of years, and in that clashing together eventually evolve fantastically complex forms. With that comes the idea that the soul, human soul, is made up out of atoms, because there's only atoms, nothing more. Atoms and emptiness. The human soul is made up out of atoms, just as the body is made up out of atoms, and that the soul will disintegrate when the body disintegrates. Therefore, there's no afterlife. Therefore, there's no judgment in the afterlife, no punishment, no reward. Whatever meaning we have in the universe is here and now in this world, and whatever political, ethical, moral meanings we can make, we have to make here and now by ourselves, because there is no God who will determine whether we've made the right decisions or not, and reward or punish us accordingly, and so forth and so on, including the belief, as Lucretius says, that there must have been, because of this notion, other creatures who existed in the earth, other species that existed before us, and other species who will exist after us, because nature is constantly experimenting. And those things that can find food for themselves and reproduce will probably persist for some period of time. Those things that can't do so will disappear, and eventually everything will disappear and transform in the endless dance of mutations of the atoms. Now, all of that came back in one piece in 1417, because the rest of it, the whole philosophical tradition, all of Democritus, all of Leucippus, almost all of Epicurus is lost, and lost forever. And then this text, this magnificent poem, came back. There were only a handful of copies, 2, maybe 3 possibly, that existed in the world. A fire, an earthquake, an act of destruction would have done it in. But it came back in this one moment when an obscure clerk took the book off the shelf. For me, this is one of the great thrilling stories in human culture.
As mentioned, New Historicism has evolved as a method describing culture in action, which draws upon the works of Kierkegaard, Victor Turner, and other cultural anthropologists. Typically, in written and literary text, New Historicists bring to the forefront a minor historical event, anecdotal in appearance, like a marginal note in a manuscript or a dream recorded in a diary and so on, and reread it so as to reveal the behavioral codes, logics, and motives controlling the whole society. The New Historicist emphasis on the simultaneous historization of literary texts and textualization of history entails a close reading of both types of texts. So the New Historicists are also inspired by defamiliarization tools of the formalists. New Historicism attempts to debunk the traditional notion that literary texts are autonomous, aesthetic artifacts. Instead, they consider literary representation as connected to hierarchies, resistances, and conflicts that reveal a society behavior's patterns and perpetuate and shape and alter the culture's dominant codes. The task of the New Historicist is to trace these representational exchanges, refigurations, and so on. The notion of anecdote and marginalia as alternative forms of historical analysis is very important, because they can they can be private papers, newspaper clippings, diaries, letters, and so on. And they transfer from one discursive sphere to another and illuminate a certain aspect of social history and mentality. According to Joel Finneman, another member of the New Historicist group, anecdote produces an effect of the real, perceived as an occurrence of contingency that punctures the teleological, timeless narration, Anecdote establishes an event as an event within the narration, and yet without the framing context of historical successivity. In other words, anecdote's narration it's both it both compromises and refracts the narration it reports. Louis Montrose also stressed that this contextualization of literature involves a re-examination of an author's position within a linguistic system and the recognition of the ability of literature to challenge social and political authority. On your screen, you have some of the most important publications, the major studies by Catherine Gallagher, Louise Montrose, and Joel Fineman. A further inflection of new historicism emerged in the studies of Jonathan Dollymore, Alan Sinfield, and Catherine Belsey, who adopted some of the theoretical refinements in Raymond Williams' Marxism and Literature from 1977, especially his distinction between residual, dominant, and emergent aspects of culture. This inflection became known as cultural materialism, and it can be described as a politicized form of historiography. The term was inspired by the work of Williams himself, and it gained currency with the publication of Political Shakespeare, New Essays in Cultural Materialism in 1985, a collection of essays edited by Dollymore and Sinfield. Cultural materialism and new historicism share many assumptions in common. Both are interdisciplinary or even anti-disciplinary approaches, and they view human history and culture as a complex arena of dynamic forces of which only a subjective and partial view can be constructed. They argue that selfhood develops in an exchange relationship with its cultural milieu, and that it is important to explore the material forces of production. Although new historicism focuses on anecdotes and marginal historical records, cultural materialism does not distinguish between high and low cultures, that is, between canonical artwork forms and popular culture. This means that they include work on the cultures of subordinate and marginalized groups. Unlike new historicism, cultural materialism is more openly committed to highlighting the political dimension of text, especially given its Marxist roots, mediated through not just through Williams, but also Althusser, Macaray, Gramsci, and Foucault. Cultural materialism focuses on the interventions whereby people make their own history, whereas new historicists focus more on the circumstances of this process, for instance, the ideological and power structures that restrain them. Cultural materialism is more optimistic and utopian, and it does not agree with accepting the skeptical strain of post-structuralism present in new historicism, which points towards the impossibility of attaining secure knowledge. Another difference is that while new historicism focuses synchronically on co-text contemporary with the moment of the text production in order to uncover hidden alternative historical possibilities, cultural materialism resorts to the co-text that have appeared ever since in order to situate the exploration in a diachronic time. British cultural materialism developed as a reaction to the work of F.R. Leavis heavily in the 1950s and influenced by Matthew Arnold and their belief of a social mission of English literature and that good literature is of timeless significance and serves the transmission and reinforcement of moral and social values, instructing students and readers in order to secure ideological control.
1961, to his death, Raymond worked in Cambridge, first as a lecturer and then as a professor. Among his initial students was Terry Eagleton.
Raymond Williams and I arrived in Cambridge in the same year, in fact, in 1961. He as a college fellow, after a long stint in adult education, and me as an undergraduate, having taught for a year in a northern secondary modern school. It was hard to say which of us was the more alienated in this strange upper-class place, but the experience for me of hearing Raymond Williams lecture was quite extraordinary, because it was as though one saw somebody magnificently articulating with a kind of enviable ease and eloquence and intellectual sureness one's own most muddled and half-thought-out political feelings. And it was as though Raymond was giving a kind of authorization to other people to speak, to see him in that strange and really quite unlikely environment, speaking out on behalf of the dispossessed and the alienated, with a kind of shrewdness and sureness that made one wonder where this was coming from. I mean, how could a man speak with such confidence in this way if he came from that kind of dispossessed community himself? And I think I realized only later that Williams could speak with that kind of eloquence and serenity because of an unusually strong experience of closeness and solidarity in the working class community he came from, which I think really propelled his political project throughout his life.
As mentioned, cultural materialism figures prominently in the work of Jonathan Dollymore and Alan Sinfield, and in their common work, Political Shakespeare, Essays in Cultural Materialism. And they highlight three aspects: consolidation, which is the ideological means whereby a dominant order seeks to perpetuate itself; subversion of the dominant order; and containment of subversive pressures. So Dollymore and Sinfield take Greenblatt's working definition of radical subversiveness, and they explain that it's not merely the attempt to seize existing authority, but a challenge to the principles upon which authority is based. And they elaborate on it by emphasizing the context of its articulation. So according to Dollymore and Sinfield, the power structure is made up of different, often competing elements, which produce culture precisely through appropriations by authority institutions for their own purposes. Subordinate, dissident, and marginal elements can also appropriate dominant discourses and likewise transform them into the process. Jonathan Dollymore was an English social theorist who was mainly interested in the field of Renaissance literature, especially drama, and also worked on gender studies, queer theory, art, and censorship. He pioneered cultural materialism and gay studies, and his groundbreaking book, his first book, Radical Tragedy, from 1984, reassessed the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, recognizing the increasingly historical and ideological functions of drama. So he argues that the humanist critical tradition has distorted for modern readers the actual radical function of early modern English drama, which had to do with the critique of ideology, demystification of political and power relations. His second volume, Political Shakespeare, Essays in Cultural Materialism, was co-edited with Alan Sinfield in 1985 and challenged again this liberal humanistic notion exposed by Leavis and Matthew Arnold, and highlighted the political dimension of Shakespeare's work, embracing a broad range of issues such as subversion of authority, sexuality, colonialism, as well as modern receptions and appropriations of Shakespeare. Another book from 1991, Sexual Dissidence, retrieves the lost histories of perversion and traces the term perverse back to its etymological origins and epistemological origins in the work of St. Augustine. And it explores it in relation to Freud and Foucault, and also in relation to homophobia. And then another volume entitled Death, Desire and Loss from 1995 discusses perversion in relation to Western notions of identity. And in Sex, Literature and Censorship from 2001, he explores the relationship between ethics and aesthetics, exploring the dangerous knowledge. He calls for a shift in critical values from theoretical learning to experiential knowledge, endorsing a criticism of being historically imaginative inside a perspective which one is also critically resisting. Another powerful reinterpretation was formulated in Alternative Shakespeares in 1985, in which a wide range of writers participated, including Catherine Belsey, Terence Hawkes, and Jacqueline Rose. Drawing on a vast range of theories from psychoanalysis to structuralism, Marxism, and feminism, they draw attention to the manner in which Shakespeare's texts produce meaning and construct the human subject and engage larger structural and ideological issues. Catherine Belsey is another British literary critic and academic who has chaired the Centre for Critical and Cultural Theory at Cardiff University and then at Swansea University, where she's Professor Emeritus. Belsey has written about the effect of romance novels on modern society and urged the new history to adopt the perspective of change, cultural difference, and relativity of truth, and to give priority to the production of alternative knowledges and alternative subject positions, something that she seeks to do in works such as The Subject of Tragedy, Desire Love Stories in Western Culture, Shakespeare and the Loss of Eden, and so on. She criticizes the construction of 16th and 17th centuries of the normative and ultimately oppressive ideology of patriarchal family values and the reinforcement of heterosexual monogamy.
Theory is thinking about practice. In other words, not just doing whatever you habitually do, but reflecting about it and self-consciously choosing to do it a particular way. But the word theory has become, this is a longer version, has become a sort of shorthand for a particular take on language, a particular interest in the way language works. And I think the theory that's been prevailing in the last 20 or 30 years, which is my heyday, is one that insists that language is not transparent, but opaque. That's to say that what we need to do is not look behind it or beyond it or the other side of it, but at it, especially if we're critics, if we're on an English course. That's our main preoccupation.
Returning to the United States, a very interesting contemporary scholar is Jerome McGann, who has extended New Historicism in order to explore the emergence of novel forms of material practice during the Romantic period and to connect them to his explorations on digital humanities. And his work and his research is explored in Lecture 3 on ekphrasis and intermedial studies in this series of lectures on critical theory. So to conclude this lecture on New Historicism and Cultural Materialism, we have seen that New Historicism covers a wide range of approaches to the study of literature and history, often in conjunction with many other, ranging from cultural studies, post-colonial feminism, gay lesbian criticism, and so on. Just to name one example where New Historicism bridges with feminist studies, we can mention recent work on 19th century American sentimental fiction and how it offers, in the words of Jane Tompkins, a critique of American society far more devastating than any delivered by better-known critics such as Hawthorne and Melville. So on your screen, you have several feminist critics who have worked in giving visibility to sentimental fiction as a political tool in the American Revolution and in the formation of the United States.